We're all familiar with change. It's the only constant, as the saying goes. But transforming something and making real progress, that's another beast altogether. Today we answer the big question: what's the difference between change and transformation?
I actually don't think it takes a certain type of person. I think it takes a certain mindset, and the art is to how do you adjust everybody's mindset.
The biggest thing I've learned, just taking the time, change and transformation is about people at the end of the day.
Remove fear. If fear exists, the coalition can't come together.
Transformation change is difficult, so I've always believed simplify it as much as possible. Don't make the complex complex.
We recorded this episode in front of a live audience in November 2024. Since then, Mark Wilde has moved from CEO of SGN to the role he now holds as CEO of HS2. While the conversation is still as relevant now as it was a few months ago, you'll hear some mentions about Mark's job title that are now outdated. Let's get on with the show.
Hello and welcome to a special live episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Annie Wong and I'm joined by my co-host Lizzie Elston.
Hello.
It's a very special episode today because we've ventured out of our Green Room studio and come to Deloitte's Experience Transformation Conference, where we have a wonderful live audience who are ready to explore our next big question with us. We're all familiar with change, but transforming something and making real progress is a different beast altogether. It's about moving from who you are to who you want to be, about reinventing a business or redefining an industry, or taking on a project so big it impacts lives for years to come. So today, we'll be exploring the idea of transformation and learning from those who have been there and done it as we ask the big question: what's the difference between change and transformation?
That really is the question, and to help us answer it, we are joined today by Mark Wilde, CEO of SGN and soon to be CEO of HS2. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
And also by Lorraine Mackin, who is the Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Government Leader at Deloitte. Hi, Lorraine.
Hi.
So let's get started and set the scene a little bit. First of all, if I start with you, Mark, what does transformation mean to you? And secondly, as a follow-on, can you give us an example of a transformation that you think has changed everything, whether it's a company, an industry, a society, the world?
Well, thank you for having me on. Really appreciate it. You've got the ant and deck of transformation here.
And we've worked together before, haven't we?
Yeah.
On transformation.
We have. I like your definition, actually, of it's a change of state. If anybody, there's a few people in the audience here who've worked with me before. My definition is pretty simple. Transformation is getting out of the drift that would occur anyway. I don't even like the word change, to be absolutely honest, because I think change to me is just the continuity of what happens when we work together. Transformation is kind of getting beyond that drift, the act of leadership to move something from A to B, breakthrough. I guess for me, you asked me for some examples. My whole career has been in the business of breakthrough and change. So I couldn't pick out one, it wouldn't be right. People associate me with Crossrail, but if I look at my whole career, they've all been either small incremental transitions or they've been very large. The company it's sad to leave actually, SGN, the energy transition, I'm sure Lorraine will pick it up, is probably the greatest single transformation we face in our lives anyway. So that would be for me. I don't know about Lorraine.
Yeah, I think it's similar. We'll probably come and touch on energy transformation. I think that is the biggest transformation program the world's ever gone through. But I think, picking up on what Mark's just said, I think it is in the difference between change and transformation. One's an extension of the other. But I think with transformation, you are really focused on an end state vision, really impactful, broader than just changing business as usual and making it a little bit better than it was yesterday. There's nothing wrong with that either. I've got a background in continuous improvement as well. But to me, transformation is around fundamentally changing something and impacting probably a broader set of metrics. Certainly the transformation, I've been involved in lots, and I'll probably draw on them as we go through. The one that I'm probably most proud of is one that I actually did in Australia, which was the creation of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I think was termed at the time as the biggest transformation in Australia in a generation and since the formation of Medicare. And that was really right from the very start, working with Prime Minister Julia Gillard, all the way through the definition of what is that end state vision, what's the case for change, and how do we actually bring not only everyone involved in creating that service, but how do we bring the whole of Australia with us? Because clearly it was a fantastic scheme, £26 billion scheme that had never been done before anywhere in the world, but we needed to do it in a way that created that case for change, that was almost that future vision, and get that change sort of everyone behind that change in Australia to make it work.
Fantastic.
That's a great example, Lorraine, thank you. For me and maybe many others, the idea of leading on transformation at the scale that the two of you have done sounds very daunting, overwhelming. What is it about you that makes you go, that's for me? Does transformation require a certain type of leader or leadership?
No.
I don't believe you.
Okay. No, I don't think it needs a certain type of leadership. It needs a certain mindset. Cotter identified, traits of transformational change, and that they'd resonate now. Building a guiding coalition, communicating it, having a sense of purpose. So for me, it's about a mindset to. It sounds terrible. It sounds almost like God, what's he talking about? But if you want to be in the business of making something better, whether it's society better, you're about discontinuous change. And to me, that's just leadership. So I actually don't think it takes a certain type of person. I think it takes a certain mindset. And the art is to how do you adjust everybody's mindset.
So I agree. I think it takes a mindset. I think it takes a growth mindset. This is where Mark and I might differ. I think it does take. Well, does it take a certain type of leader? If I reflect on all the transformation programs I've been involved in over the last 20, 30 years, some have been fantastic. Some have not maybe performed quite as well, and some have just fizzled out. We all know of those transformation programs sort of 5 years later. Nobody can quite remember why they started on them, where they were trying to get to, and people have got different opinions about how successful they are. I think the most successful transformations are the one where you've got a really, really outstanding visionary leader with the right mindset. I am going to embarrass Mark here, because I think Mark is if I pick the 4 or 5 biggest and most successful change programs I've been involved in, the work we did together in London Underground would definitely be up there, and that's in no small part to Mark's leadership. Of course, it wasn't just him, it was the leadership team, but the approach Mark took to the leadership of that transformation program was materially different to maybe what some of the clients would have took. And I think that shows up in the results and the outcomes.
It's about purpose to me, about being purposeful. And I do think, anybody from Arup in the audience or in here, and I love the way that the Arup people, they read the day one speech, don't they, from Orv Arup from 1972. So if you join Arup, you're forced to read Orv Arup's speech. Another good Newcastle person, right? There's a theme. In Arup's day one speech, he speaks about simplicity of engineering, making a better society, improving the quality of engineering. So for me, the guts of all of this are purposeful. That example from Julia Gillard in Australia is a great example, isn't it?
It is.
I was there when it occurred. That's a very purposeful thing, and from that provides the springboard, I think.
Real meaning for society as a whole. So Mark, given that you've got all this experience, we'd love to learn a little bit about what you've learnt through all that experience, and perhaps, I know there's probably an awful lot of things, but perhaps the biggest thing that you've learnt that you can share with us.
The biggest? Wow. Well, outside of this idea about transformation being something that gets beyond the drift of what we do anyway, I think that's like the big takeaway for me. The conscious feeling that if we stayed where we are, certain things are going to happen. So I'm going to join HS2, start on Monday. If I didn't join HS2 and Lorraine was leading HS2, there would be a different outcome. I'm not saying it would be better or worse. There'd be just a different outcome. So for me, my big takeaway is, how do you collectively come to a mindset of changing something transformationally? And my big, if you ask me for my one thing, it was one of Cotter's 8, the coalition. The fact that together we are much more powerful together. Genuinely owning the whole of the transformation is the key. And I look at many transformation activities. Lorraine's right, most fail. And the reason most fail is that the coalition is genuinely not owning the whole. They are fractures, you can't even see them, But for me, I don't know if Lorraine would agree. Once you've got the purpose, the next thing is to get the gang, all the gang together to it. I don't know if you see that.
Yeah, I think so. And just taking the time, I mean, the biggest thing I've learned over 20 or 30 years is just taking the time up front and all the way through. Change and transformation is about people at the end of the day. We've touched on the energy transition and obviously look at sustainability and climate, which I think is the biggest change program the world has ever attempted. It's about taking people with you on a journey. Which isn't just about the vision bit, but people will get there at different stages. We used to have a change curve, which was looking at 20% of people will be leading the change, 60% of people will wait and see, is it actually delivering benefits, and will come across. And then there's always naturally 20% of people who will really, really struggle, and maybe that's either not the organisation for them or not the programme for them. But I think keeping that in mind in terms of just keeping people on that journey, collaboration is absolutely key. And the biggest thing I'd probably learn is expecting there to be bumps along the way and reacting to that in a way that we learn from those bumps along the way and take it as an opportunity to improve further.
When you go in, how do you start with these sorts of things? I always wonder, where does one begin?
3 things, and they're pretty straightforward. Number 1, purpose. Don't even bother starting if it isn't purposeful. Number 2, a sense of humility and 2 ears and 1 mouth, because generally the people engaged in this generally know the truth. And then number 3, the idea of bringing people together. I just wanted to build on something Lorraine said. Everybody would buy getting the coalition into the transformation is a key thing. Lorraine said something, you said bumps in the road. For me, remove the sense of fear. Remove fear. If fear exists, the coalition can't come together.
So how do you do that?
The modern way of saying it would be an inclusive environment, That would be a modern way, which I believe in. But in a more human sense, it's just, don't be an ass.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's good advice.
Be humble. Be a nice person. Have good values. Speak nicely to people. Don't shout at people. Invite other people's perspectives. Keep your ego at the door. So, I think just generally what my mother would have told me is probably was good advice.
Very familiar. We did a podcast episode recently called Can You Be Kind and High Performing?
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, yes, you can.
I want to come back to the point around purpose, because I think it's a really interesting one, and what role transformation plays in the world right now. Is it around changing how a company or industry operates and how it stays competitive? Or are you seeing it more as a kind of force for good and driving more positive social, economic and environmental outcomes?
I'll start with this one. I think it has to be the latter. And I think that involves companies transforming internally, but whatever your politics are, whatever I like about maybe the 5 missions that the new government have come out with in the UK, most of my work is with government or transport clients. Those missions of economic growth, jobs, not leaving anyone behind, becoming a net zero energy superpower, safer streets, fixing the NHS. I think if you don't start with that sort of broader sense of purpose and taking people with you, I mean, the National Disability Insurance Scheme was a good example of that. It was, at the end of the day, it was a £26 billion scheme, which meant we put 0.5%, we called it a levy, but it was a tax, 0.5% on everyone who was working. And it was really, really important to really articulate the case for change and the purpose of that and what it meant to everyone in Australia, not just people who might be unfortunate enough to have a severe disability. And we spent an awful lot of time on that stage before we moved forward to the next one. So, I think the big transformations start with really thinking through what's the end state purpose you're trying to get to. I don't think it's just about the numbers. I think it's about the social side as well.
Yeah, I would say I totally agree. I mean, am I alone in not really wanting to watch the news at night sometimes?
No.
I mean, this world, something's got to change. We are not in a great position, are we, in the human race? For me, I like the word purpose, but it really matters to me. I mean, the challenges we face, particularly with the energy transition, are really societally based. So I would say If you buy the idea that transformation is simply breaking the drift of what's occurring, I bet there's nobody listening to this or in this room or on the panel who's really happy with the world. Isn't it gone great? It's absolutely gone great. So for me, it's about being a human being and creating leadership and making things better for people.
It's wonderful. On the subject of people, both of you alluded to the fact that transformation requires bringing people with you. I wondered if you could just perhaps give us an example of how you go about doing that, getting people on board, bringing them with you. Lorraine, do you want to?
I mean, we always used to, I can remember when I first started looking at transformation, both internally and then with clients, we had this 4-box model, and particularly when you're quite junior, that you really cling on to those 4 boxes, don't you? And the first box was really talking about what are the drivers for change, what are the burning platform. Why would you embark on a big transformation? Because it can be uncomfortable. A lot of it doesn't actually deliver, and not everyone wants to go on that journey with you. So I think really spending time looking at what's the counterfactual, what's the burning platform, why are we doing this? Why do we want to embark on that journey? And clearly having a clear vision and purpose for the future. I think that you co-create with the team. That doesn't make it easy, but you've start to break down the problem and start to engage people at an early stage. But if people don't know why continuing business as usual, it isn't the way to go forward. It is starting with really being clear on what's the burning platform and what could a better vision look like for the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, for me, when I recruit people, particularly recruit people into transformational areas, you're looking for 2 things. We've mentioned one already, the ability to own the whole, i.e. stand in somebody else's shoes, not see your mates fail. Very different to collaboration. So collaboration's the entry level. You're looking for people who genuinely own the whole of the enterprise. The next thing you're looking for is transparency. Transparency is all. Now, the person at the top has to create the conditions of removing fear, but once the fear is removed, and people are owning the whole, you're really looking for transparency, because generally the problem in transformation is that, I don't know if you agree, Lorraine, the gaps, the silos, the misinterpreted agendas.
Yeah.
So I think owning the whole and transparency are the ingredients in the transformational cake.
I guess with the transparency as well goes trust, because there will be times when leadership are having to make decisions which perhaps do need to be made behind closed doors, but if your organisation trusts that you're making them in the right interests of the business, then that goes with it, perhaps.
Yeah, well, there's 2 ways. I've learned this in my career. There's 2 ways of trusting. So Lorraine and I have worked together before. We've worked together, and through that work, we learned to kind of trust each other.
Yes.
Or we decide immediately we're just going to trust each other, and that's the transformational angle. Yeah. So I walk into HS2. There's 35,000 people in it. Or you go to London Underground, there's 25,000 people. You've got to start by saying, I trust you, and you can trust me. So I think there's something powerful in that.
And I think that trust is built through that transparency, including admitting, when you're starting a programme off and it is wobbling. And I think, we've had some programmes together, Mark, where they'd be maybe wobbling in the early stages. You'd be surprised if they wouldn't, because they're really complex operating environment, usually highly unionised. And I think having that trust and transparency with each other, and that's why I enjoyed working with Mark and the leadership team so much at London Underground. It really felt like a shared endeavour. We've all had our brilliant clients, but we've all had clients where it feels as if the transformation's yours and you report into the leadership team. Certainly working with Mark and the leadership team at London Underground, I think Mark had a very clear vision, but it felt like we were in it together. And we had that transparency of me being able to admit when maybe we were wobbling or didn't have the right people, and vice versa, having some very honest conversations around how do you make change and transformation happen in such a operational sense.
That was really interesting to learn about, sort of getting people on board and trusting them. And then the other question I wanted to ask was about kind of the idea of having a fixed end goal to your transformation. So is it important to have that, or is there some fluidity to it? Can you end up in a different place to where you thought you might start?
It's a fascinating topic. The great Daniel Kahneman passed away last year. So Daniel Kahneman, people have read his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Acting Fast, yeah? Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002 by identifying that people like us are generally biased, and generally biased to optimism. Yeah, I guess we all recognise this. You know, you wouldn't do the jobs that we do if you weren't highly optimistic. But he also identified other biases, confirmation bias, groupthink, uniqueness bias. Nobody's ever done this before. You know, only I can attack this. And Kahneman basically identified with the Nobel Prize. I'm not going to argue with it, right? That basically these biases drive people to be highly, highly optimistic. So I think the idea, and you know, we lots of people in this audience and listening to this probably worked with me on it. In Crossrail, the big breakthrough was thinking about transformational change in pixelation. Today, I couldn't tell you exactly the day HS2 is going to open, but I do know when I start working with the team, there'll be a range of outcomes. It's highly uncertain though, and you know, this idea of having pixelation, a pixelated view, that you gradually increase the high definition and narrow the uncertainty, is the art of major program management.
That's interesting.
How do you build greater definition while narrowing the uncertainty? In Crossrail, which used to have a terminal end date, you know, I was part of it, you know, let's all go for it. The window only narrowed in Crossrail 4 weeks before opening it.
Okay.
You know, the window only narrowed to, God, the reliability was right there.
Yeah.
And I think, by the way, I think Elon Musk, quite an interesting character, can't really talk about his political views. I do read the way he runs SpaceX though, and they are all about the gradual engineering increasing of high definition and the narrowing of uncertainty. And that's the art. So if anybody tells me, they could tell me the day HS2 is going to open, it can't be done, you know. It's about narrowing the uncertainty.
But it's hard, isn't it? Because you've got so many stakeholders and you've got the media spotlight, you've got the public. I guess that comes down to communication and...
Well, my Crossrail example is, you know, Crossrail had a terminal end date 9 years in advance. We ended up with a window of about 18 months. And that had to be narrowed. And my learning on Crossrail was you can communicate highly complicated things in a simple way. I mean, I think Lorraine's good at this. I mean, this is part of the art, isn't it?
It is. I mean, transformation change is difficult, otherwise everybody would do it and everyone would do it well. So I've always believed simplify it as much as possible. Don't make the complex complicated. But even if you took a project like Crossrail or HS2, you know, you could say even when it opens, I think it's the transformational impact of things like that will have an end date, it will open, hopefully someone will cut a ribbon, it will be operational. Really, that's just the start of another journey, isn't it? And to me, the exciting thing about, and we talked about that when we were talking about your new HS2 role, and it's great that we've got leaders who will step up into those programs and make sure they deliver. So if you think about the transformational impact that's going to have for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, not only to London, but obviously depending on where it gets to, transforming the sort of the north and hopefully its productivity and the opportunities for people who are living there. To me, even when you've got something open, it's the transformational impact that I know both you and I probably share a real passion about, the impact of what it can deliver rather than getting to the end stage, which is highly volatile.
I really agree with that. So when I look at emerging leaders, so if you've got people who are maybe 10 years after their graduation, you know, so they're maybe getting into their first sort of senior roles. The characteristic I'm looking for is that nuance of dealing with uncertainty. You know, the tell for emerging leaders is somebody who's desperate to please. You know, I can get that done. It's almost heroic. And I think these days the contemporary management style would be leaders who are nuanced. You know, they're probably consensus builders. They're highly transparent. They probably can communicate and understand the difficulty of uncertainty. And if I was an emerging leader now, things I wish I'd known in my 20s and 30s was if you're somebody like me or Lorraine, you really value the nuanced, you know, the realistic approach, high ambition, high realism. And I think that is the key to transformational success.
What do Nigella, Ed Balls and Gordon Brown have in common? They've all contributed to Soup for Good, a cookbook for a cause. It's been created by Cook for Good, a social enterprise Deloitte are proud to support as part of our social impact programme, 5 Million Futures. Every purchase supports the incredible work that they do, tackling food insecurity, social isolation and barriers to work on a social housing estate in London. Find the Soup for Good cookbook on the Cook for Good website and discover how a simple, delicious bowl of soup can make a world of difference. Head to cookforgood.uk.
Related to uncertainty, I guess, and you mentioned it earlier, is around like bumps in the road. I'd really like to hear more about how you've navigated some roadblocks that you faced along the way. Particularly, Mark, you've taken on projects that have had roadblocks, and how have you managed that and dealt with that volatility and uncertainty and seen it as an opportunity for better transformation?
I think it comes back to transparency. I think you've absolutely got to encourage everyone in the organisation to surface those problems, to solve the ones they can solve on the front line. And that's, again, a big thing that Mark and I have done together on previous projects, is equipping the front line to really solve continuous improvement problems that they can deliver themselves, but really just encourage them to surface those bigger problems and collaborate to solve them. I think the bigger the programme, the more, if you took something like a Crossrail or an HS2, and this is absolutely your area of expertise, you've mentioned firms like Arup, there'll be hundreds of different firms involved in that supply chain delivering those programmes, as well as all of your own teams on the ground. And I think, as I say, encouraging all of that to surface the problems and work collaboratively to solve them, and accept that not everything is going to go right first time, but the key thing is to learn from that and continuously improve.
Actually, a guy passed away only a couple of weeks ago, one of my great sort of mentors, a guy called Phil Houghton, who was a real railway guy from Derby. And he came from a production mindset of Toyota. And in Toyota, there is red or there is green. Red, you should be very curious about. So another characteristic I'm always looking for leaders, curiosity. Yeah. What does that mean? Why is it red? Oh, I didn't expect that. Certainly when I was in Crossrail on the board, red amber was like the favourite colour, red amber. So red amber means red, doesn't it? We're just too frightened to say. So I think this curiosity is really very important. And red is not a bad colour, right? Red is probably something to be curious about. And again, back to the removal of the fear. Equally, green is really only about in calibration. So I think there's a lot to be learned from production engineers, continuous improvement, Japanese techniques. Really believe that. And I think you take any transformational risk register out, the biggest tell that there's something wrong is the colour red amber or amber. On the fence, not sure.
So we talked a little bit earlier about sort of success and what that really means, and the importance of transformation and getting to success. And it's a difficult question, but what does success look like? Is it as simple as saying we achieved what we wanted to? Or is it broader than that?
I mean, I'm somebody who's been fired 3 times in my career. Nicely, I didn't do anything wrong. 3 times in my career, I've been asked to do something else. Each time, I got a better job. So success to me is a bit more transcendent. It's about learning. It's about development of yourself. It's about expansion. When I finished Crossrail, the best bit of advice, I couldn't face another train, to be honest. And, the then chair gave me the best piece of advice, which was go and do something where you learn. And a bit like Lorraine, I think the energy transition is the place to be, isn't it? Yeah. And I've learned a lot in the past 3 years. So I think success to me is something about a continuum rather than a defined, again, another tell. People who are seeking glory is another watch out for transformational leaders. You really want those curious leaders who've had the bumps in the road, they've learned the hard way, they've had difficult times. Yes. You'll agree with that? I'm
completely. Sure. And I think it's not just even in terms of the outcomes and the impact and the purpose of the overall programme. I actually do think it's about the learning and journey on the way. I mean, interestingly enough, when I first started working with Mark on the London Underground transformation, and I won't share the name, but that was someone leading the transformation from your side was someone who'd started on a previous transformation programme with me 10 years previously, and we'd not seen each other for quite a while. And it was great to see him in his new role, or client side, leading one of the biggest programs around at the time. I think it's about the whole thing. Looking back at some of the great transformation programs I've been on, they haven't just delivered a great outcome for the client or society, but you look back at the team that were with you along, and you must be hugely proud of that Crossrail team. I mean, that comes across every time you speak about that program, is the development of the team along the way and that team's capability and how that team might then disband and go on to lots of other different things and the impact they'd be having. I think it's as much about that as it is about the outcome of the program you're on.
I would say one thing I have learned in success that might be helpful, specifically about transformation programs. One thing I think people get wrong, either in infra or in business transformation, chasing deterministic programs. So, you know, one of the big tells is if you put it purely deterministic, people will say things like put air in the system, push people, a goal to chase. The problem with deterministic programs is people lose all the time.
Yeah.
People like to win. So I think put enough air in the system time-wise, and I think in success it is important for people to win on the way. If you're continually losing, that isn't a great position to be. So I think, I'm not saying manufacture success, but you cannot be on the losing end, which is where Crossrail, I was on the board of Crossrail before I got into difficulty, and the team it was the same brilliant team. All I did was add a few ingredients. The difference was they had something they could win. You know, they were sick of losing every day.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen that in programs. People
Yeah,
get demoralised.
they do. You've got to build early wins, early successes. Literally celebrate every success. Learn from it. How do we replicate it? How do we scale it? I think they call it a positivist sort of view of let's take what we're doing really, really well and see how do we actually scale that, because a different approach to transformation, but can be really successful as opposed to looking at the as-is and what's going wrong and trying to improve it.
So when we think about measuring success, it's not just the outcome at the end, it's you're measuring, you talked about quick wins, presumably you're measuring as you go, and because these things can take a very long time, can't they? So how do you measure success?
I used to work with a very good colleague who's now running East West Rail, a guy called David Hughes, and he always made the point of totemic things. And Kotter talks about communicate. I do like the early wins, but picking those wins to be totemic is quite interesting. So for example, one of the big problems in all major change is the operator and the builder become separated out. So I think, early in programs, you really want to celebrate how the operator's influences given something. So I'd be very clever with the totemic symbols. I think symbolism is really rather important, actually, in transformation.
Yeah.
So let's say you've had lots of successes along the way, totemic successes, you've celebrated the journey, etc. You've reached your destination. Then what? Is transformation ever done? And if you do think so, what do you do when it's done? Do you move on to the next project and try and be even more successful in the next one?
We normally move on to the next program, don't we? But it's a good question.
Well, I have got a. So my leadership ethos is what you call transformation. We might talk in a minute. I don't like the T word, right? I actually don't like the T word.
We have to rename our podcast. You're in the wrong conference.
I think the T word has challenges, which we could talk about. But if you buy my ethos is, the thing we're calling transformation here is getting beyond the drift of what will occur anywhere. I think it more of as plateaus. So in my current company, we had a certain safety challenge, which we thought was completely unsolvable. They solved it. Now it's their business as usual, and they're gone to the next peak. So I see more transformation as plateau-based. Really quite an important concept, that. And if you think about a plateau being, like a flat bit of ground that we all get up to, the other key thing about the plateau is everybody comes to it. You don't leave anybody behind. Don't leave anybody behind. So this idea of ratcheting, so I don't think it does ever end, personally or in organizations. But plateauing is one of the most important things of a transformational configuration control.
Completely agree. I mean, even if all things stayed equal across a transformation, which is unusual in the world today, and even more unusual, the volatility in the world today, I think that sort of getting to a certain stage where you've got a step change in a state or performance or an outcome, but then bedding that down, I guess what you would call that plateauing stage, but then looking at what's the next level of improvement you want to drive it to, and whether that's triggered by external competitors or things going on in the world or just new breakthrough technologies. I just think it never ends. There's always some piece of technology that will push you to the next level.
Yeah.
Can I say why I don't like the T word?
Yes, please do.
So I think the medium of leadership is conversation. My ethos is leadership is getting beyond what would happen anywhere. That's why we're here. We're here as leaders. Why am I going to HS2? I want to change the drift together with my colleagues. I think the medium of that is simply conversation. It's not emails, it's not blogs, vlogs.
Is it PowerPoint decks?
It's not PowerPoint decks. It is conversation. So I think words matter. And I think the problem with the word transformation, it's just been overused. It's too ubiquitous. I like words like you've just used, breakthrough, plateauing. I just think be careful, it's become too ubiquitous for something that's so precious. I don't know if you, you must have been engaged in hundreds of transformation programs.
I have.
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
How many were genuinely transformational though? And how many were labelled transformational?
I'd say about 40% were genuinely transformational. There was a lot of what I would call productivity improvement, nothing wrong with that either, cost cutting, and there's nothing wrong with that when you have to, or even some service improvement projects that I think were dressed up as a transformation program. But yeah, probably maximum 40%, and then I would say of those probably 20% successful, because it's hard. But if you get away from that, we're going to go on a transformation program for 3 years, and then there's a sense for people of, will it then end, and will we get to steady state? The reason we've never got there is the world is changing faster around us.
Yeah.
Sometimes in terms of risks coming, and hopefully sometimes in terms of massive opportunities coming. And I think, it's incumbent on us to keep, particularly when, there's the strong purpose-driven vision to it, to keep on that journey.
As we wrap up, I feel like we've covered lots of different topics around transparency, incremental successes, taking people on the journey. What we like to do is offer advice, tangible advice to people in the room, people listening. So if I were a business and I was considering my next big, complex breakthrough transformation, Lorraine, what would you say would be a really good piece of advice or learning point that you would like to give them?
Have a clear vision and make sure it's purpose-driven, and create that with people. Make sure you've got the right leadership in place. Make sure you've got a learning culture and a continuous improvement culture. And I think the biggest transformations today, we touched on the energy transition and climate change, have got to involve collaboration, and that, taking the whole that Mark recommended. Most of the true transformation, I don't think, can be achieved now between any one organisation or even set of businesses or even one sector, actually. I think it's about all those things coming together, but being very, very clear what the sort of the purpose is behind it.
So to add something different to that, this might sound a bit Zen-like, right?
We like Zen.
For me, the modern leader will become conscious of his or her leadership style. They will be reflective of their role in the effort. So what do I mean by that is, a lot of people think of transformation as solving problems. Actually, I think the art of transformation is the intervention into gaps that exist, and you've talked about bringing people together. So for me, you see a lot of leaders who enter transformational activities thinking they've almost got to sweat it themselves. All I'm saying is become conscious of who you are, how you're going to show up, what your footprint is, what the shadow you would cast, how are you going to approach it. So think about your role as a leader. If your leader is to do all the things that Lorraine said, how do you as a leader in a clever way bring that together? And that's the modern leader for me. Nuanced, thoughtful, considers their position relative to the gaps that exist, thinks carefully about the guiding coalition. They are the great transformational leaders.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Final question for you both. We always like to finish our episode and bring us back to the big question. In one sentence, if you can.
Or two.
Or two. We'll give you two.
Maybe three.
What's the difference between change and transformation? Lorraine, I'll come to you first.
So I think change is constant and is evolving from where you are now to make it a bit better, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think transformation is more around the end point, the purpose, and is usually more fundamental.
Well, I think, yeah, I totally agree. I'd go back to this idea of leadership being in the business of getting beyond what would occur normally. And change to me is just the backdrop of what will happen anywhere. Transformation is what we achieve through our singular and collective effort.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. It's been great having you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad, original music by Ali Barrett.